Okay, hi everybody. Oh, so this isn't really going to be a lecture. I'm just going to say a couple of things, mostly about really kind of beginning to understand uh, autoethnography in the context of ethnography, but also like conventional anthropology. So this is really a week where I want everybody to kind of get into the mindset of ethnography as a kind of genre. And if we think about just categories of expression, autoethnography is something that is really, really complicated because it doesn't really fit into categories very well. And you'll find this out when you watch the documentary with Zora Neale Hurston, because Zora Neale Hurston herself is somebody who is so singular and unique that you find in this 2 hour documentary that the biggest hurdles that she had as a kind of revolutionary thinker were hurdles with dominant narratives, with conventions, and especially those conventions as they play out within academic spaces. So for our purposes in this class, because autoethnography is a course where we are using the genre of autoethnography to kind of challenge received ideas about academic expression, this documentary will feel very fitting. So, a couple of things that I'm just going to say up front about the homework, just to kind of clarify for people, because I think it is a little bit tricky. What I'm asking is that I mostly, the most important thing for this week is that you watch the film, and that you take notes on the film and that you have feelings about the film. I don't want you to, go to ChatGPT first as a way to kind of learn about Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston's kind of biography is what the documentary is about, but for our purposes, it's not just about learning Zora Neale Hurston's biography, it's also about learning what it means to be a genuine autoethnographer. And to my mind, Zora Neale Hurston is really the first person who is working within a convention, within a discipline, which is anthropology. She's intervening into anthropological research, and she is literally creating a new subgenre within the field of anthropological research. And so it's just incredibly exciting to learn about somebody like Zora Neale Hurston because she is so um, courageous, and she is also just somebody who like she knows what she wants to do with her own life, and so she's trying to rely on the opportunities that are available to her to be able to do what she wants to do with her life, which is to do, she's almost always categorized as a folklorist, which I think is accurate, but she was a much more expansive practitioner of art and thinking than being, kind of consigned to folklore. She was really, really into drama. She was really into performance. And I would actually call her in some ways a performance artist. Um, and I think you can kind of get that sense when you're watching the film too. So most importantly this week is to watch the film and is to really kind of think about Zora Neale Hurston, not just as like this kind of interesting person, but as somebody who is claiming, and hence the name of the film, who is claiming a space that is not only is she historically kind of excluded from as both a Black person and a woman, but also like claiming a space in the world as a human being who is kind of thinking outside of the box. And so that's really what I want you to focus on when you're watching this film. As for the homework, you have two options, and they're really just kind of getting you to target two areas of writing and expression out there right now. One of those is timed writing, so that I know that a lot of students have experienced time writing conditioned in school, and so I'm giving you that option so that you can just kind of get comfortable doing that in this space without like the classroom presence and without kind of any punitive situation. So sometimes when you go from the classroom space where where the writing conditions are timed into the college space where they're not, you can find yourself really struggling with time management. So the timed writing is just, I'm going to set my timer at an hour. I'm going to watch this film. I'm going to take notes while I'm watching it, and then I'm just going to spend an hour kind of writing about my impressions. For me, that's time better spent than the ChatGPT option. I think the ChatGPT option, which I'll talk about in a second, is there so that you can begin. I'm always going to have you use ChatGPT so you can see how shitty it is, but also to kind of, potentially use it in a way that you can challenge yourself. That maybe, that maybe is a challenge that you can't find in any other circumstance right now, other than to run it through the chat GPT and then begin to kind of look at what it's preventing you from seeing, but also maybe what it is kind of facilitating. Uh, so first and foremost, the timed writing for me is like just taking, for some of you, what you've already done in a classroom environment and importing it into a kind of a more independent space where you can use it as a feature of time management. So I want to give that option. Um, Try to, when you're doing the timed writing assignment, actually have notes with you, and try to, make some kind of a point. Try to have some sort of a thesis statement. Avoid the biographical thesis statement because, again, like I said, this is a class where we're really learning about the genre of autoethnography. So as much as you can, say how much you love Zora Neale Hurston, which I have had students criticize her, which is always shocking to me, but um, it's not really about the wonderfulness of Zora Neale Hurston. It's really about Zora Neale Hurston as an autoethnographer and the difficulties of, uh, you know, insisting upon the value of one's own voice. In her case, that would be the Black vernacular that she was studying, hence the title of folklorist. But also, not only one's own voice, but one's own experiences as the primary value in the learning environment. Um, as the guide, right? So this was kind of like what we really learned from watching this documentary, in so many different ways, right? So you could take notes on that, and then that could kind of be your thesis if you were to do something like that. Now, as far as the Chat GPT thing goes, right, you are right, you are kind of following this um, as the requirements for doing the Chat GPT option. If you don't follow these requirements, in other words, right, if you just run it through Chat GPT and you haven't removed the subheadings, you haven't really tried to utilize the the mechanisms of Chat GPT in a way that make it feel like you're personalizing it, then I'm not going to give you any points on it because why would I? It's just a machine spitting something back to you, right? So um, I do call it a machine. I know it's not a machine, but that is what I call it. So if you are going to use the Chat GPT option, you have to follow these rules, okay? Which means that you have to include the notes that you used. You have to say that you used option two. Um, you have to talk about original details from the film. That has to be kind of the primary thing. So, it can't be a Chat GPT response that is just about Zora Neale Hurston. It has to be Chat GPT about the film. Okay. And if it is not, again, I am not going to give points for that. All right. So, like I said, you can do that option if you want to play around with it. But for me, the best use of your time is probably the timed writing version, because what that's going to do is you're going to have your notes, you're going to practice in the space of, let's say you've got 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. to kind of try to create something cohesive. So that's really going to show you where you are. It's also going to really show me where you are with your expression so that I can help you identify places that you need to improve in, like a lot of us right now really need to kind of work on paragraph breaks. uh, what I've seen in the last couple of years is a lot of people have sort of lost their ability to use paragraph breaks for a number of reasons. I want to blame everything on AI right now, but paragraph breaks have become a real problem for whatever reason. And I just want people to begin to kind of practice with breaking their paragraphs. So when you write in a timed writing condition and you try to break your paragraphs, that's going to help me see how you're really thinking about breaks, um, as a way to kind of organize our reading and our thoughts about whatever it is that you wrote. Okay, so that's really, so the homework is really like, you know, watch the film, take some notes, try to say something about it. That's really the homework for this week. Now, as far as the film goes, what I have asked everybody to do is to first read Thinking Like an Ethnographer. Now, the reason why I have set up the homework like this is because first of all, our textbook, as I think I've said before, I don't know if I said it in the recording at the beginning or to people during office hours or whatever, but our textbook is not perfect. It's free. That's why we use it, because this is a zero textbook cost course, and I don't want people to have to pay money for textbooks. This is a very conventional textbook. It is going to introduce you to, as we have done in the first week, key concepts, vocabulary, the language that people use when they talk about ethnographic research. However, because of that, it has a lot of problems, okay? And we can see these problems right away. So this chapter is really important in conversation with the documentary. Um, because when you watch the documentary, you're like, I can't believe that's what the that's what the Thinking Like an Ethnographer chapter says, but it really does show you where we are with ethnographic and autoethnographic research. Even now, right? Autoethnography is not a widely practiced form of research. It's not widely respected as a form of research. And I think we're still in many ways where Zora Neale Hurston was 100 years ago, with um, kind of validating uh, personal voice and personal experience in academic spaces for the very same reasons that Franz Boas in the movie, the so-called uh, father of ethnographic research, um, right? The ways in which he too was kind of resistant to Zora Neale Hurston as somebody who was like a serious thinker, a serious academic, because she wasn't following these kind of uh, you know, uh, established guidelines for ethnographic research. So one of the things that I want to point out is that you get this little right background in history of ethnography, and Franz Boas is like the first person that is mentioned, and he takes up a significant part of the film. Uh, in these like little slides I made you, I did a clip where uh, they talk about Franz Boas in the film. So if you go to slide 4, you can look at it. I had to record it with my phone because I wasn't doing this lecture yet. So maybe in a little while I'll actually play it from the film. But if you go there, you can rewatch the part with Papa Franz Boas. And some of you, when you did the week 1 key terms, you talked about participant observation as like an important term, and he is the person who really created this kind of idea of anthropological research as something that takes place within communities rather than being studied in a library, which is literally how white anthropologists worked prior to Franz Boas and this kind of transformation, this really what they thought of as like a revolution in anthropological research, which was to go into communities and be this kind of like objective observer. So to this day, anthropological research, ethnographic research, is really kind of about being this so-called impartial observer, and that came from this dude, Franz Boas. So, as with everything, right, it was a revolution during its time, but now it is very conventional, and it has become, as things often are, kind of a form of gatekeeping. So, one of the things I want you to pay attention to in the film is how this guy, Franz Boas, is at this time widely celebrated. He has a ton of power, a ton of money is being funneled into his stuff because he's making a huge name for himself. And he's incredibly, for his time, open-minded, largely because he, like it even says in the film, because he was really invested in people, and he really was invested in anthropology as this thing where you go into communities and you literally spend time with people. So they talk about his work on the Inuits. So he's like really invested in indigenous people and learning about indigenous people. And a lot of the people he works with, they tell us, are women and people of color, right? So when you look at thinking like an ethnographer, right, you get this image that I'm talking about right now about Franz Boas, right? He is, you know, here we'll just read this, right? Relativity or cultural relativism is the understanding that certain cultures and societies are not superior to others, but rather they are just different. Before his research studies, it was common for scholars to assume that Western societies were superior to non-Western societies. So this kind of claim that you become kind of, as a cultural relativist, you kind of basically adopt the mentality of an open mindset, and you're observing. So the strictness that he is adopting is this kind of like, this idea that you have to, as an ethnographer, maintain a mentality of open-mindedness, and therefore it's kind of like objective. Zora Neale Hurston, in her practices, really kind of challenges that. First and foremost, you'll see in the film, she tries to do that in her own community and is treated as an outsider. So the performance of the thing that she has learned at school actually prevents her from doing the kind of work that she is trying to do, from getting the kind of material that she's looking for, which is expressions of authenticity from her community, expressions that can only come when people are with people that they feel comfortable around. And so this is like a really, really problematic part of ethnographic and autoethnographic research, right? Because I think in large part it's because it's like saying that it's like removing this idea that we're subjects and that we have a subjective perspective, right? And then adopting a criteria that shows that. And that's really what the social sciences are, right? Is that it's that you're adopting this criteria that minimizes the impact and potential hazards of the subjective point of view. So for all of you, these are the kinds of things I want you to think about, or is it's like there's ethnography, which is kind of the basis of cultural relativism, where you keep this open mind and therefore you're able to have access to communities that are different from your own. But then there's autoethnographic research, which goes a step further and really is the study of one's own community. And that too has all kinds of complex features to it. So we don't learn any of that when you're reading this this chapter, right? You learn about Boaz, you learn about the people that he mentored, Margaret Mead and Zora Neale Hurston, both very, very famous. And you learn this little bit of information about Zora Neale Hurston, which is that she's the first Black woman to graduate from Barnard, which is like the thing that gets stated all the time over and over and over again, which I think is really interesting about her, considering that she was, well, at least to somebody like Alice Walker, who wrote a very famous essay about Zora Neale Hurston that then resulted in Zora Neale Hurston's work being taught in undergraduate programs in English, which was a really big deal. But somebody like that is really going to emphasize the fact that Hurston was pretty much a genius and that the work that she was doing was absolutely incredible. So like the fact that she graduated from Barnard is like a big deal, but she did a lot more than that too that we learn about in the film. Um, so the textbook is going to give you the standard, as textbooks often do, the kind of standard picture of ethnographic um, of the history of the history of the development of ethnographic research and the ethnographic mindset, which, as I said before, is kind of acting as this kind of impartial observer, and that's something that Zora Neale Hurston was criticized for that she didn't do, and that she really struggled with, and even tried to do, and often kind of failed at it because it just didn't come naturally to her, and it really didn't help her achieve her goals as a researcher. So. Uh, So when you get to the film, what you're going to learn is, right, there's the information again, right, that she was the first Black woman to graduate from Barnard in 1928. But you're also going to learn that even her contemporaries in the Harlem Renaissance, and for those of you who have never heard of the Harlem Renaissance, it is this period of time after the end of slavery and in the beginning of the 20th century, where is this massive explosion of Black literature and music, and it's when you see all kinds of Black art and Black poetry, and Zora Neale Hurston is a contemporary in this time. What we also learn, though, is that even her contemporaries were critical of her, in large part because she was not somebody whose art was explicitly political, and a lot of the art and literature that was coming out of this time was work that was kind of social activism. So it's very similar to now in some ways, that there is this kind of zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age where you see this kind of uh, surge of activity. And Zora Neale Hurston is inside of that, but she's also a loner. She's also constantly traveling, and she's also constantly spending time with the people that she's interested in representing in her art. So again, right, there's this kind of wonderful way in which, as an autoethnographer, as somebody who is a folklorist, who is interested in travel and who's interested in actually spending time with the communities, not only that she's observing, but that she actually loves and cares about. It kind of like isolates her, and it puts her in this really vulnerable position. So, because autoethnography is so special, one of the things that I want everybody to think about as you're starting to do this kind of work for yourselves, you've all gone out and you've done environmental observation. And one of the things that I really want you to think about as you're adopting the ethnographic mindset is right, not just what am I seeing? And since we're doing sensory ethnography, right, not just what am I seeing, what am I hearing, what am I smelling, right? What is this outside landscape? And how do I learn to describe it well? But also that I part, right? That subjective point of view is something that you're going to become increasingly aware of as an idiosyncratic perspective that comes from your own experiences. And that requires reflection on your experiences. It requires really practicing with the way that you talk, the way that you write, and also kind of understanding the distinction between the two, right? So if I'm the way that I write, for example, and the way that I talk in the past has been incredibly different. And as I get older, the way that I write and the way that I speak sort of begin to merge in these really interesting ways for me. And I think that that's because I have been writing for so many years that I'm getting better at writing. So when you think about, what does it take to be a good writer? What it takes is a real self-awareness about the many different things, the many different ways that you express yourself, whether that's in writing, that's in speech, that's in song. I mean, it can even be in the way that we exercise, right? Or whatever you're doing. There are many different ways to express yourself. So not only just thinking about the many ways you express yourself, but also being like, really aware of the way that you interact with the outside world, right? So um, part of the way that you do that is you ask other people or you notice how other people, whether that is in literature or film, or even if you're like out and about with your friends, your parents or whoever, paying attention to how other people express themselves and recognizing the difference between the two. And sometimes that can feel really wonderful and juicy, right? Like, wow, I never thought of it that way, right? We've all been in those kind of situations where we're interacting with something that makes us think, wow, I never really thought of it that way. But we can also have that experience and it can feel incredibly alienating, right? Oh, I never thought of it that way. Right. So when you start to pay attention to that, you actually develop your critical thinking skills, your critical awareness. You develop a more critical relationship to the world that kind of helps you identify what you like, what you don't like, what you disagree with, what you agree with, and really begins to kind of shape and hone your point of view. So Zora Neale Hurston is somebody who really, really, really valued Eatonville, where she came from. She really valued um, the her origin story. And, we do learn that her mother died when she was 13, and her mother was somebody who was always telling her that she was right. And we learned that her mother was somebody that she continued to draw inspiration from even after the loss at 13, because her mother said, right, you should always reach for the sun, and taught her children this idea that you should live your life, and you should live it in a way that's actually like striving for beauty, striving for life and light in your life. And we can see that right in her efforts, despite so many hurdles and difficulties, that idiosyncratic expression was something that took hold of her at an early age. And so she's always coming back to Eatonville. She's always coming back to her roots. And she's always, even in the spaces where she's not comfortable, like when we learn about her going to Haiti and really kind of struggling with how to tell that story, right? Because as we learned from the documentary, she's not really comfortable centering the Haitian perspective. And in part, it's because her own experiences with voodoo and with the stuff that she did in the South is kind of intervening in really problematic and probably very interesting ways. So moral of the story is, right, that uh, autoethnography is really about kind of prioritizing your own perspective and learning how to do that in a way that is engaged with the world, right? It's always reaching outward and toward. So there is this constant back and forth between the internal landscape and the external. So I am not going to say much more about the film because I really want you to kind of get your own sense of the various things that mean something to you. So I have these timestamps. I'm gonna finish the timestamps and post this on the week 4 module, so that you can kind of just go through and look at things if you want to while you're doing your homework. This one's not done, so I'm right around this part. But think about it this way. Week 1, you did key terms. This time you can do kind of key figures because there are a lot of people in this documentary. And I talked about Franz Boas. Obviously, you know how I feel about that guy. And then there's this horrendous woman, Charlotte Osgood Mason, who is like this really, really wealthy white benefactress who is a primitivist. And primitivism is so, so, so important as a concept that really gripped. Well, I mean, it really starts in the 1700s, but for our purposes, it really gripped the white wealthy American imagination at this time, probably because of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's deeply, deeply racist. And so, benevolent racism is like the term that you can kind of think about for somebody like Charlotte Osgood Mason, and the idea of the wealthy benefactor. Um, there's a lot of that going around right now as well, right? A lot of patronage, a lot of, especially with the federal government withdrawing so much funding from the arts, a lot of people are being forced to turn once again to the wealthy benefactor to pay for things, to get things done. So it's really important to pay attention to the role that somebody like Charlotte Osgood Mason plays in advancing the careers of Black um, writers and poets and thinkers at this time. And so Langston Hughes, Alain Locke, both of who were deeply critical of Zora Neale Hurston, are also are also people who Charlotte Osgood Mason supported as a benefactor. And so that's somebody to pay attention to. But other figures, right? The other people who are like not as terrible as Franz Boas and Charlotte Osgood Mason. There's just like a whole bunch of key players at this time that really showcase for me what is so complicated about Zora Neale Hurston's career. She is in this position of being dependent upon people who are expecting her to deliver material that she doesn't exactly believe in. So we learn that on the one hand, she's trying to go out and film and like take pictures and gather information that sort of reflects back to Charlotte Osgood Mason, like what she wants to see. And there's this like terrible sense of compromise that comes with that. And then you see the pictures and they're like absolutely beautiful because it's Zora Neale Hurston. So she's doing that on the one hand, right, to satisfy this kind of creepy benefactress. And then on the other hand, she's like trying to do her own work. So the pressure that she's under to like give these people what they want so that she can keep doing what she wants to do, which is to like, for example, produce work on Cujo Lewis, which I think is like really worth looking at the final slide. So I've got this final slide with some works cited on there for you. But Cujo is really somebody to like that's worth um uh oops, where was I? Yeah. Who's really worth kind of reading about. I think that the Barracoon, which is the book that was published in 2020, almost 100 years after this work was made, is a work of genius. I mean, it's absolutely incredible how Zora Neale Hurston captures this man's idiosyncratic expression. It's almost like so it's dialect, but it's I mean, literally in the film they say it's like his own language, and she couldn't get it published because publishers constantly wanted her to make his, and this is so important for you, class, like they insisted that she make his language transparent for the general audience. So they wanted her to edit it so that it was understandable But the whole point of this book is actually that as a reader, you are required to do that work of understanding on behalf of this person who lived this life and whose biography is revealed to you through his idiosyncratic expression. There is no Cujo without his dialect, right? He would be stripped of what makes him who he is and how he expresses his life to Zora Neale Hurston as an ethnographer. So when you're thinking about something like, being an objective observer, you have to think about the importance of what the goal actually is, right? Is the goal to center the experience of the community? And if it is, as we learn from Franz Boas that it is, right? That's what he says as being an impartial observer, then of course you must faithfully represent that person's expressions, right? Just as our expressions need to be faithfully represented by us to the best of our ability, which is another reason why I hate ChatGPT so much, right? It strips us of that, right? It becomes the editor that insists on having our language be sort of translated for a general audience and therefore watered down and therefore stripped, truly in this case, stripped of meaning and value. So it's incredibly important to us that we learn that Zora Neale Hurston did this work, that she did it under these conditions, and that B, she never compromised on her view that this work is absolutely meaningless if you take away um, the 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 dialect, the speech, the actual expression of this person. And she was so invested in that she actually refused to publish it. And like I said, it was just published 5 years ago. So Barracoon is the work. You learn about it. You can actually, I think I have. Yeah, I think this is on the thing. So you can read all about Cujo, and just a really incredible story. And in the film, you can also see her footage of him. So I think it says that she's got like 15 minutes or something of recorded footage. So as I've said to some of you before in our meetings, this class is a multimedia class. So I do really want you to kind of think about recording, whether that is, and do both, right? When you're taking pictures, that's one kind of representation, right? Here we see this like beautiful image of this person, but we don't know exactly like how he moves his body. When you see that video, when you see that the recording, you see body language, which gives you another window into a person's mode of expression. So when I see a picture, I get one version. When I hear audio, I get another version of expression. Down the line, when we do interviews, you'll hear the WPA, which uh, was the federal government paid people like Zora Neale Hurston, gave them some funding to go out and do these kind of recordings of, in the case of some of these recordings, former slaves. So Cujo's a former slave, and later we'll hear another one, and that's audio. So listening to the actual voice, but also, seeing video. So all of these, and of course the writing, right? The writing itself. So when you have all of these kind of different layers of expression, and that's why it's multimedia, um, you get not only a fuller picture of the person and their modes of expression, but you also, I think, get a more informed understanding of the person who's doing the representing, right? The documentary filmmaker or the ethnographer or the writer. You get a more intimate sense of the kind of work that this person is doing to represent either a member of their own community or someone else, right? It really tells you a lot about the artist or the author. So multimedia is just really good. It's really good to work with different modes of expression. It helps you understand a lot. Okay. So, like I said, a cast of characters, right, in this documentary really want you to pay attention to not just Zora Neale Hurston, but the people that she's dependent on, and also the people that she's invested in working with and on his behalf, right? So the people that she actually cares about, people like Cujo. And I think this is like where I ended last time. But I do want to, I am going to play. Um, should I play that clip? Well, I'm not going to play the clip because I don't, it's just too hard to watch. I know it's just really difficult to watch somebody talking on these videos. So I'm not going to play the clip, but I do want you to play the clip. So I'm going to timestamp these so that you can go back and play the clip. But the reason why I put Their Eyes Were Watching God there is because I am spending so much time talking about multimedia. I'm talking about interdisciplinarity, which means that we're like merging all of these disciplines. It's social science, it's humanities, it's art. There's a little bit of science that gets thrown in there. And also just kind of like multiple genres of expression, right? Fiction, poetry, music. There's a beautiful image that comes up a few times in the film where we see Zora Neale Hurston playing drums with the church, right? With people at the local church. So, participant observation is like you're just supposed to go and kind of sit there and observe and like take your little notes and write, but she's actually in there with the community. So when you really think about the difference between somebody who is kind of in there, and somebody who's sort of sitting there and observing, I forget the term. It's not in front of me right now, but there is this term that you probably some of you wrote about where the ethnographer, what is it? It's like shaped, something shaped. But the point is, right, it's the presence of the ethnographer is always going to influence the way that the community behaves, right? So that objectivity itself is also kind of a fiction insofar as if you are let's say you're having family dinner, right? And somebody's like, I'm just going to sit here and observe and write notes. Everybody's going to act completely differently than they normally would, right? So if you're just go ahead, go about your business doing your thing. Don't mind me, right? It's like every time I get observed in a classroom, they're like, don't mind me. I'm just going to be in the corner taking notes on your performance and whether it's good or not, and then you'll get a raise or not, right? Of course, that's going to change the way that I do things, but they always say, right, just go do your normal thing. And you're trying to do that and you feel like totally weird. And anybody who's been in a situation where they're being observed like that knows this, that it influences how you act. Now, if I've had a person come into my classroom and observe and they try to participate in the experience, I've had a couple of, cool people who come in and they'll like answer, I'll ask a question to the class and they'll answer the question. And that actually creates conditions that feel more natural for me, even though I'm aware I'm being observed, right? I start to lose my sense that this person is kind of present and watching, and that enables me to express myself more naturally. So this is kind of something that Zora Neale Hurston is always doing. So the reason why I want you to focus on this little clip from Their Eyes Are Watching God is because we learn that we really learn not only what an autoethnographer is, but we really learn what a genius Zora Neale Hurston is. And Their Eyes Were Watching God is her most famous novel. And it is where she merges this autoethnographic field, force field that she has kind of exists in. I think that's just like part of her consciousness as an artist and as a person and as a person in the world. She kind of merges it into this novel. So it's fiction, but it's also autobiography. There's music, there's video, right? And you can kind of see the whole landscape of autoethnographic possibility, I think, in that clip. So that's just that would be one of the reasons to kind of hone in on that clip. The other thing is this the final thing I'm going to say? Well, I'm going to just say one more thing about the conclusion. But the other thing is, and I realized that I jumped from like minute 35 to minute 128. So I do have some stuff to account for, and I will. But the other thing I kind of want to say before I get to the conclusion is this toward the end of the film when they talk about her the op-ed that she writes arguing against the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So a lot of what we're going to be doing in this class is really not going to ask us to get into history. If you take my Writing 2 class, that's where we will really get into kind of contextualizing our lives in a sort of socio-political landscape. Probably won't get to that in this class because this is a beginner's class, but uh, the Brown v. Board decision kind of moves us toward that insofar as it is truly one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in this country. It effectively ended segregation, and it in the dominant narrative of this country, Brown v. Board has been taken as kind of, it religiously depicted as positive. From all corners, right? There's no, it's just sort of across the board, like considered a good, unless you're somebody who is deeply invested in in critical race theory, for one thing. So if you, right, if your perspective is, okay, Brown v. Board ends segregation, right? But it also ends this possibility of and reality of culturally supported spaces, culturally supported education spaces where Black students are learning together and they have Black teachers. And the problem is not that there aren't white students there. The problem is that these spaces are underfunded and under-resourced and deprived of the kinds of resources that you need actually to make your education as robust as it possibly could be. So Zora Neale Hurston is kind of commenting on that. A lot of people misrepresent that view because they're racist, but when Zora Neale Hurston writes that op-ed, she is condemned because the ball has already gotten rolling, right? That this Supreme Court decision is so great and we're going to use this and it's going to be the dominant narrative that integrates schools. And people who have a vested interest in that do so for many, many different kinds of reasons. But any Black person who has an interest in it is doing it, as we learn from Ruby Bridges, because they want their children to have access to the resources, which is completely understandable. So she's not really discussing that. She's actually talking about this other aspect of culture. And so when you get to the op-ed in the documentary, you already have 2 hours of a person who has shown you their deep, deep, deep love for Black culture and their deep understanding of the need not only to preserve it, but to participate in its power, right? And I think there's like this great part where she is doing field work and she's reading Langston Hughes poems to these guys who are like workers, and they're so into Langston Hughes because he is a Black poet. And so they're showing that she's also somebody who's in this position as an ethnographic researcher, not only to represent culture, but also to shape it. And I think that's really the point. So I'm almost done. So this is the kind of the conclusion that I've been kind of trying to get to, which is that, right, the threat of autoethnography in academic spaces still to this day, right? People are like, what do you teach autoethnography? What's that, right? Right, the threat of autoethnography really is the threat of valuing our idiosyncratic expression. So like I say at the very end here, and I'm just going to read this out because I've already said all of this stuff, I think. But right, and you got to love this documentary, right? It's a lot of academics are speaking on her behalf, which is kind of ironic and funny because, right, these are people who have tried to get her work legitimized in academic spaces, and they have succeeded in doing that, right? So I read Zora Neale Hurston when I was in college. She was one of the one of the writers, I read Their Eyes Were Watching God when I was in college because it was required reading in my class. So the documentarians are really invested in legitimizing her work, and I think that's something that's kind of interesting to think about. But one of the documentarians says, right, she's ahead of her time. But what I'm saying is, right, she's not just like ahead of her time because, right, we still don't value autoethnography. What she is right, she's doing humanizing work. So unlike ethnographers who saw themselves as salvagers, and we learned that phrase, salvagers of cultures they regarded as endangered or dying off, Zora saw the culture she documented as alive and bringing life because she insisted on the value of one's own expression about their own life. In a world that so thoughtlessly encourages students to forego their own language for the dominant academic language that AI is getting better at producing every second, and you, I'm sure, know how I feel about it at this point. Let's think about Zora's impulse to be herself, and in being herself, was able to see others like Cujo Lewis, whose name we probably wouldn't know if not for Barracoon, right? So autoethnography is really about, it is in some ways kind of about finding your voice. So that old tradition of like a writing class is where you learn to find your voice, but finding your voice is actually really hard work, right? So that's the idea, right? Finding your voice actually takes learning how to identify your particular modes of expression and then develop them, right? And developing them stylistically, but also developing them consciously. So there are two ways, right? There's two paths kind of always in conversation with each other, the stylistic development and also the consciousness of yourself. So that self-awareness and that exercise of self-expression uh, is actually the thing that helps you to begin to see other people because you're able to, right, as we kind of come back to the point of thinking like an ethnographer, there is no hierarchy, right? It's not my culture is better than your culture, although, we all can feel that way simply because we know it better, right? It's better because I understand it. It's not, right? It's not better or worse. It's not a hierarchical thing. It's the understanding of difference, but it's an understanding that really is something that you can bridge through a kind of consciousness of um, the not only the importance of your own self-expression, but also like the sacredness of your own self-expression, right? The humanity of your self-expression, because that is something that is the result of your lived experiences. So when Zora Neale Hurston is invited into these academic spaces where she gets to go learn how to be like professionalized as an anthropologist, she's always insisting on the value of her lived experiences, right? Her time with her mother is the best way to think about that as the central aspect, the central guiding principle of everything that she does moving forward. So that's my lecture, such as it is. I'm going to post this and I'm going to finish up the timestamps. And hopefully this is helpful to you, not only with your homework this week and really kind of trying to begin thinking about the importance of the work that you're interacting with in this class, but also just beginning to really take seriously the work that you're doing as the field work that you're doing as ethnographic writers in this class, right? Your field work, the stuff that you're writing in your notebook, even the things that you're not turning in now when you come to the end and we begin to design this kind of digital booklet for this class, you'll begin to understand how important those little things that you write down and capture are to the development of your own voice and being able to actually go back over the last 10 weeks or whatever that we have until we really get to uh, the interview portion of the class when you start talking to people. But between now and then, collecting all of these kinds of observations that you're making in your notebook so that you can look back and you can begin to identify um, and develop idiosyncratic modes of expression. Okay, my throat's starting to hurt, so I'm going to stop now.